Well, hello there, and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you're listening to episode 492 of Sustainable Minimalists. This is a listener-supported show about intentional and eco-friendly minimalist living. And on today's show, we are discussing the concept of rootedness. What does it mean to be rooted? And why on earth is having deep roots, deep connections with nature really darn important in the 21st century? Now, we all know about the roots of a plant, right? Tree roots are an anchor for the tree. They keep the tree straight and stable. They absorb water from the soil. Tree roots take nutrients and other chemicals out of the soil and use them to produce what they need for growth or repair. But there's a two-way relationship happening when it comes to roots, because root systems help reduce erosion. They hold soil in place. And so even after the tree is cut, roots attached to a stump stabilize soil for years. They reduce the risk of landslides. And of course, when roots decompose, they return to the soil, adding precious nutrients. So it's a two-way relationship happening with the roots of a plant. But now let's get figurative. A human's roots are, of course, figurative. We have no roots coming off of the bottom of our feet, do we? When we talk about a human's roots, yes, we're talking about lineage and ancestry, but we're also talking about values and personal beliefs. When you are rooted, you stick to your character, and at the same time, you honor where you've come from. But by contrast, when you're uprooted, you're untethered. You're vulnerable to outside influence. If you're not careful, you may be swept up and away. So yes, on today's show, we are discussing the concept of rootedness. In what ways can nature root us so we're not swept away by prevailing beliefs and societal norms? And let's not forget that two-way relationship as well. When we are rooted, what does that mean for our own quality of life? Sure. But also, how can being rooted improve our relationships with the planet and with others? That's what we're doing today, and here to help me do all of that and more is Lyanda Lynn Haupt. She is the author of a book that I read and loved. It's called, take a guess, yes, it's called Rooted: Life at the Crossroads of Science, Nature, and Spirit. Lyanda, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. How are you?
I am so good, Stephanie, and I'm delighted to be here. I love your podcast, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Same. I must say, my new hobby, and my listeners know this, but my new thing is to go into my library and check out the news section, like new to the library, and just see what piques my interest. And Rooted was there. And I mean, it's about life at the crossroads of science, nature, and spirit. And I thought to myself, yes, this book was written for me. So checked it out. I read it all in, I think, 24 hours. I loved it. And so I'm so happy that you answered my email to come on the show. I want to know, though, how did you find yourself writing this book? Like, how did you find yourself called to write Rooted?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've been writing for this is actually my sixth book, and all of my books have been about science and nature. And in a way, they've all encompassed those three things: science, nature, and spirit. But overtly, they've been mostly science and nature. I write mostly about birds, actually. I have a book called Crow Planet, a book called Mozart's Starling that's about our creativity in nature, inspired by the story of Mozart and his starling. And all of my books have had a kind of a spiritual underpinning. And so I want to say that I am using that word super expansively to talk about nothing religious. So if you are religious or not, it doesn't matter for reading this book or thinking about these ideas. What I meant by spirit is that part of ourselves that we can't explain by science and yet has to do so much with our beautiful human intelligence. Things like wonder and awe and creativity and imagination, all of those ineffable qualities that make us who we are and have so much meaning in terms of the way we interact with the world and one another and with nature. And I wanted to draw that into the conversation with science and the way that we live our lives. It's something that I've been thinking about my whole life. And I decided the time had come to write this kind of, I use this word lightly and playfully, to write a kind of manifesto about what I've learned and things that I think would benefit us all to think about and converse about and live.
That speaks to me. I must say, well, we'll talk about your childhood in a minute, but it sounds like you had a childhood that was heavily based in nature. I did not have that childhood. That was not a leading value by which my parents did not send me outside, let's say. Yours perhaps did. And I want to talk about that. But as I've grown, as I've matured, yes, I've noticed that I feel happier in nature, yes, but it's more than that. It's not just about happiness. It's about feeling more connected. It's a sense of connectedness. And I think that's what you're perhaps speaking to there. And of course, with the spirituality piece, there's an interconnectedness that happens, at least for me and perhaps for you, in nature. But I want to go back and talk about your childhood because you had it, and in the book, it sounds so lovely. You're playing with frogs, you're playing with creatures in woodland creeks. How did your early upbringing influence your connection as a child and all the way up until now with nature?
You're right. You make it sound idyllic. It was a normal suburban childhood. But I was really fortunate. I lived in just a dead end cul-de-sac suburban neighborhood here in the Pacific Northwest where I live. And my parents it was that kind of life that's gone from most of our urban/suburban lives where our parents would send us out in the morning and we'd play all day and come home at night. And we had an empty field behind our house and a canyon that led down to a creek behind that. And so, like many writers, I'm introverted. I loved playing with my friends when I was a kid, as I do now, but also just really valued time in solitude. And so I'd bring my apple and my sketchbook. I like to draw down to the creek and really just spent time lying on my back, watching the twinkling leaves and catching frogs I learned that I could catch frogs not by pouncing on them, but by just lying on my back and slipping my hand under them and gathering them onto my belly and resting there. And so that was my little alternate society and world. And in fact, I thought of that place as a kind of church with the frogs as my congregation, even as a weirdo kid and who's being raised Catholic. And I thought, oh no, maybe I'm doing something wrong. And I actually called this book, until the last minute, this kind of a fun fact, this book Rooted was called Frog Church, until my editor finally decided that was too weird. So it is a chapter in the book and the title is Rooted, which I think is much better. But what I do want to say is, so yeah, I had parents that encouraged us to be outside. I loved birds and we had binoculars by the back door and field guides. And so just that interaction was encouraged and supported and seen as normal. But I do want to say, Stephanie, and maybe we'll get into that in the conversation, that not having that experience as a kid and not even being able to offer that kind of daily run outside to the creek at the bottom of the canyon in the backyard kind of experience to our kids doesn't mean that we can't live lives that are much more deeply connected to nature and offer that to our kids too.
I'm going to table that. I want to talk to you about that because I'm thinking about how, at least in 2024, my kids, despite my best efforts as their parent, are living a more indoors life than I did, circa 1990, let's say. And I don't know, I have some musings onto why that is, but I want to table that. And I just want to tell you a quick story. It relates to your frog church. My husband and I, we took our children, our two daughters, on a road trip. We went to a national park. We went to Washington, D.C. My husband and I filled every moment with fun. We're doing all the things as parents, trying to make this a memorable trip. And if you asked my children what their number one moment of this trip was, it wasn't the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. It wasn't the fancy dinner we went out to. It was none of those things. Their top memory, and whenever anybody asks us now that we're home what the best part of our trip was, it was feeding the squirrels nuts. in Washington, D.C. We packed a lunch, we had nuts, and they learned, similar to you with your frogs, that if you just sat quietly, nature will come to you. And they're telling everybody that their number one memory of this jam-packed, fun week with aquariums and museums and hiking and this and that, their number one, the thing they're going to remember is getting close with the squirrels. We have plenty of squirrels in our backyards, but I'm just saying that to say there's something so powerful about sitting quietly and interacting with nature. I think my kids learned that this week, and I definitely learned that through observing them. So I guess my question is, though, we're living in a world today in which the outdoors, nature is vilified. I'm thinking about just last night, my town was spraying their chemicals for mosquitoes because Massachusetts is currently undergoing a triple E infestation. It's a mosquito-borne illness, Eastern equine encephalitis. So we're pushed indoors in so many ways. What do you say to parents or anybody listening who is thinking, yeah, the outdoors is great and all, but there's an awful lot of dangers?
Right. I think that is incredibly cultural. We have grown up most of us in lives that are so separate from the outdoors that we haven't learned to trust ourselves. We haven't learned how safe we are in the world that we evolved to be part of. And it doesn't mean that we can just of course we have to have common sense. Of course we have to, just be sensible and not stupid. But for the most part, we're very safe in nature, and we've been taught otherwise. I'm going to share a story back with you, Stephanie. So my daughter she's an adult now. She's 25. But when she was young, we got chickens in the backyard, and it was a twisted point of pride for me that we had chickens before it was a thing. We were ahead of the trend. So we had these, they were so wonderful. And my daughter would go out and collect eggs in she called it her eggs basket. She was little. And one day we had the chickens maybe 6 months or so, and she had a stomach ache, a little tummy ache. And I thought, of course, as a mom, I went straight to, oh no, she has salmonella from touching the chicken eggs. I've got these chickens, and now my daughter has salmonella, and it's all my fault. So I call her pediatric nurse, and she's one of those great, solid nurses with reservoirs of experience and common sense. And she said, Lyanda, children have been living with poultry for thousands and thousands of years. Why do you think your precious child would get salmonella from bringing in the eggs and then washing her hands? And she says she has a stomach ache. Now, just stop bothering me. And I just thought, so she brought up that common sense level of just trust. And yes, be careful. Do wash your hands after the eggs, but know that we have this long history of connection to nature. And I'm going to throw out a little statistic, if you don't mind. It's a little nerdy, but there's this researcher from Japan where the concept of forest bathing started. And so back in the 80s and 90s, when they were trying to find scientific evidence for this intuition that many doctors and psychologists had, that if we go outside, we feel better, we're calmer, we're also physically more healthy. One of the things that he pointed out in his research is that we humans have spent 99.97% of our evolutionary history outside of the built environment, outside of homes, outside of structured buildings and electricity. And what that means is that we are separated most of the time. I'm going to throw out another statistic, and this is going to be the last one, but I think it's a really fun one. We spend 97% of our time indoors or in our cars, and most of the other 3% going to and from our cars to other buildings. So That's like most of our life. So what that means is that our whole system that's evolved to be outdoors in this place where we naturally have interconnection in both our psyches and our biology, being separated from that puts us on high alert. It puts our bodies on high alert. It puts our minds on high alert because we are disequilibrialized. Our bodies and minds haven't had a chance to catch up to the change environment. And so we're stressed. So we're inflamed. So we have high blood pressure. A lot of these problems, the science tells us, I'm not making this up, the science tells us, stem from that disconnect from the nature that sustains both of our bodies and our minds. I love that. I love that there's this science that supports what we feel. Like you said, when you go into nature and you feel alive and you feel better and you feel creative. And then the science goes, yeah, you do.
Absolutely. That speaks to me. That makes sense. However, I wonder though, and I want to get into the tenets of rootedness that you aptly discuss in your book, but I wonder where the propensity to become uprooted, for lack of a better word, comes from. You do mention in your book that there's a lot of tales that we are told, timeless tales, let's say, that we get in childhood that warn us about the dangers of the outdoor world. The Witch in the Gingerbread House, Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Bears, the Three Little Pigs, like the outdoors is dangerous. And so I know you're a mom. Do you have any thoughts on combating that messaging?
I do. And I'm going to maybe answer that in two ways. One, when you said, how did we become so uprooted? I just want to point out that our culture is designed to keep us uprooted because we live in a system that makes money off of our distractions, right? It makes money off of keeping us in stores or keeping us in restaurants or keeping us consuming something and buying something to make us happy and offering us dopamine when we shop or when we scroll or when we do anything. So anything to keep us from sitting quietly in nature, which doesn't make money for anyone. So our culture is designed to keep us uprooted, to keep the money flowing. And I don't want to sound too cynical about that, but I just think having that kind of awareness. But you're right. So that's seeped into sort of fairy tales. I grew up around, there are many fairy tales have had many functions, but one of them has been to keep us in line in a way, right? We've got the Three Bears where Goldilocks has to just go right down the middle. We've got one of my favorite fairy tales is Little Red Riding Hood, where she goes and she meets this wolf who lures her off the path. So we're taught that we're not safe in the woods and we need to not trust ourselves to know what to do. And I wanted to take a spin on Little Red Riding Hood. And I do this in my book where I talk about how a different look at that tale on another level in psychology, that tale is taught from a Jungian perspective where the wolf is that part of the world that sort of lures us away from our safe maturation, away from our true selves. And I just want to throw this totally out and say, Little Red Riding Hood was on her way to her grandma's house and she had this basket of muffins that she didn't even make it herself. Her mom made it, right? And all of a sudden this wolf comes and he takes her off the path and he sets her a task. And the task is picking wildflowers. And then he runs off to eat the grandma, right? But meanwhile, what does Little Red Riding Hood do? She now has this basket of beautiful, exquisite flowers that she picked herself. She figured this is a gift from her own soul, her own spirit. And then she finds her way to the grandmother's house. She finds her own way, her own path, which is, I think, what we want to teach our children to do, right? And yeah, when she gets there, her grandmother's been eaten, and I think she gets a little bit eaten too, but they're fine in the end. And the wolf is also fine, but they emerge exhilarated with this awareness of who they are and what their possibilities are. And they put those flowers on the table, and then they feast on these muffins that now taste more beautiful than they ever would have without this winding tale of connection to the wild, connection to her own way of knowing her path and finding that path. That's what our maturation and our authenticity is about and where it comes from, I think.
I love that. And I love the main point you made there, which is that there's nothing to buy in nature, right? Like Mother Nature does not want our money. And I think I want to just sit with that because that's really powerful. In a capitalist society in which being indoors, being plugged in, being turned on, being uprooted is often synonymous with spending money, keeping our economic engines turning. Let's remember, Mother Nature does not want our money. There's nothing to buy in nature. I love that. So I'm gonna sit with that through our commercial break, Lyanda. But when we come back, we're gonna talk about rootedness. I want to really get into the metaphor of being rooted, like the purpose of roots. What does that mean for us and our children? We're gonna get there after our quick sponsor break. And we're back. Today I'm speaking with Lyanda Lynn Haupt. She is the author of many books, but today we're just talking about one of them. She wrote Rooted, Life at the Crossroads of Science, Nature, and Spirit. And Lyanda, we're at that point where I want to discuss rootedness. You make a point in the book that we would all best be served if we became more rooted. And I'm thinking about the purpose of roots here, right? Like for a tree, they're an anchor. Any thoughts on why we humans may need such an anchor in our lives that traditionally, collectively are over busy, over filled with obligations, lonely. We are amidst a loneliness epidemic. We've got a lot of problems, racism, sexism, environmental doom. Like, how could being rooted help with all of that and more?
That's a big question, Stephanie, and a good one. It is essence to me, rootedness. And what I mean by that is living a life in concert with the wild natural world, one that benefits both us as people and the natural world itself. So we enter into what the word that I like for that is reciprocity. And so typically when we think about anything, and we have this extractive mindset, and this I think plays into the subject of your work and your podcast really well, that we just take more and more without offering something back. And that is that extractive mindset, that take mindset, that humans first mindset is really at the root of, and me first mindset, at the root of all of the ailments that you listed there. So I love this concept of rootedness because roots both offer something to the world and receive from the world. And we have taken everything, even our connection to nature. So think of that beautiful idea of forest bathing, right? We know that we are healthier in mind and body. And there's all the science that spending even just 20 minutes in nature, especially in an actual forest, it balances the hemoglobin in our bodies. It balances the sides of the brain. It balances our prefrontal cortex, which has to do with our creativity and imagination. It ignites our parasympathetic nervous system, that part of our nervous system that makes us feel calm and peaceful. So it does all these things. And what science has been busy doing with all of this knowledge is telling us, okay, just walk in nature 20 minutes a day and you'll get all the benefits from it. And so it's turned into, or nature is a therapist and you can pay a guide to take you out of nature. So we've made that even into part of our capitalist system, not a circle of reciprocity, but what can I get from nature? Oh, that's just so human of us, right? So the idea of rootedness gives us this idea of, okay, I am receiving, and that's all beautiful. All of that science just tells us, affirms for us that connection we feel, that health, that and vitality that we feel in nature. It affirms how right that is and how old that is and how deeply a part of our intelligence that is. What we need to remember is the reciprocity element. When I walk into the woods and I receive all of this, what am I offering back to the world? And it doesn't have to be super obvious. It doesn't have to be oh, I'm watering the plants in return, or it doesn't even have to be activism or donations to causes, although it can be all these things. It can just be presence and witness, walking peacefully, offering your attention, living lightly, raising our kids in a way that they are living lightly and listening to the world around us as well. Like all of these things feed into health in the largest sense, a healthy human community that has the strength and resilience and kindness and courage of heart to address the ailments that you mentioned that are so hard.
As you're talking there, I'm thinking about how when it comes to nature, we humans tend to think about the natural world in terms of what can we extract from it. Obviously, like water, minerals, timber, fossil fuels, you name it. What can we take for our own benefit? And of course, the natural world can't talk back. It can seem like a one-sided relationship. But what I hear you saying there is it's a relationship that goes both ways. And I'll also say here too, I love the concept of forest bathing and sitting quietly in nature, tuning into our senses. And I want to get to how that connects to the spiritual side in a minute. But even that conversation is centered around what can nature give us? Like peace of mind and calm and perspective and this and that. It's always, what can we take? Maybe it's a tangible thing like mineral ores, or maybe it's a intangible like peace of mind. And so I really appreciate that you're bringing to light the possibility that we perhaps, by making it a regular practice of going out and spending this time in nature, like we can give something back. And the way that I know in my life I can give back is by inviting my children along with me, inviting them to experience the natural world in a way that perhaps I didn't have in my own childhood. I'm thinking about my own children and what values I want to instill in them, right? Like I don't necessarily want them to look to influencers or celebrities or the popular group to tell them what they love, or I don't necessarily want or need them to follow the pack. I want them to access their own imagination, spirit, creativity, whatever words we're using there, that lies within them. And so what I love about the concept of rootedness is that being rooted, being connected is another way to put that. Being connected to the natural world is a great way to help my children access their inner spirit, their inner creativity, their inner path, let's say, as opposed to some external thing or culture putting it on them. And I know that's not perhaps the most eloquent way to put that, but those are the thoughts swirling around in my mind. And so to that point, I'm wondering, as a mother, as somebody who wrote this book, as somebody existing on this planet in 2024, do you have any thoughts for parents who want to instill this concept of rootedness, who want to foster a love of the natural world in their own children? And I'll just say that's the question, but I also want to say I've given you an awful lot of hard questions today. And Lyanda, you've handled them like a total champ. So thank you.
Your questions are fantastic. We're living in a time of hard questions, right? Your questions are the questions that matter. I think they're great. Okay, Stephanie, I think we both know what the hard starting answer to this question of how do we help our kids to have this kind of connection has to do with our devices, right? We know how harmful it is to their poor little brains and hearts, as it is for ours, and how it steals the focus that allows us to be still, either just in our own homes or out in the natural world. It breeds this kind of swift moving of ideas and need for constant new stimulation that just depletes us on every level and keeps us from connecting to anything, let alone the natural world. So how do we do that? We have to have device-free times in our homes. We have to model leaving our devices behind when we go into the natural world. We don't need to take sometimes we say we need it for our cameras. We don't need more pictures. We don't need to take a picture of everything. We don't need to put a technological interface between our eyes and the world to make it real. And so the way we do that for our kids is modeling it and insisting upon it. We're going to go for a walk now. We're going to go to the farm. We're going to go pick berries. We're going to go do whatever. We're going to go on a hike for an hour, and no one is bringing their phone, not even you, right? It sounds so impossible because our lives have been so infused with these devices, but it is absolutely the number one thing that we have to raise consciousness about and put limits around by drawing some hard limits as parents and modeling that in ourselves. So my daughter was in college and she'd been reading some of that science about how even when your phone is in the room with you, it makes you more anxious. And she's always been pretty good being a musician and having really focused time with her cello and other instruments. She would always really turn her phone off and have it in the other room when she practiced. And that's something we can help our kids with if they're practicing anything, or athletes, or just reading. Encourage the time to do that without the phone in the room. But she called me one day from college, and she said, "Mom, I've been reading this and I really do benefit from not having my phone with me, but I need to get to class on time, or I need to get to rehearsal on time. And I don't really know so I need my phone." And I said, "Claire, there's actually this super amazing modern technology for that." And she said, "What?" And of course, I said, "The watch we gave you when you were 6. She's like, "Oh." So she started wearing a watch and leaving her phone behind. And that's something that I do too. And I think getting a watch and using that instead of our phone sometimes is a starting point for the practice of leaving our phone behind. That's one important thing. Going outside is the next most essential thing. Just realizing that even if we live in the city, opening our windows, experiencing the weather, being in the light, being in the dark, seeing the moon, seeing the stars, tending plants of some kind, all of that brings us into continuity. And I'll say one more thing about that, Stephanie. We have this idea that spending time in nature means going somewhere, or being connected to nature means we get in the SUV and we drive to nature and we hike in nature, and then we get home and we're waiting for the next time we get to go to nature. But when we think of our part in ecosystems, the impact that we have on nature is far greater from our homes than it is from those times that we're actually out in the world. So we can cultivate connection in nature by many of the ways that you discuss on your podcast, by living lightly, by using our hands to make things out of natural materials, as you've spoken about, thinking about where our food comes from. Bring our kids out to the farm or even just the farmer's market and bringing some of that food home and making it together. Knowing where our water comes from and being wise about how we use it. All of these things bring us into connectivity with the natural world as well. And so right from our homes, right, every day with everything we do, we make those choices that can deepen connection. So I think that's actually really fun to think about, that we're not only in nature when we drive there, that we are all the time with the actions of our lives.
Yes, we can be rooted all the time. We don't have to go anywhere or do anything special. It's a choice. Back to the tech part a minute. I was fortunate to have a cell phone-free childhood, but in some ways I was unfortunate because I did have a video game childhood. I had a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo. And so those video games kept me inside. And yes, my parents put limits on it and all that, but I wonder that if tech was taken out of the equation, if the indoors would lose a lot of its allure, right? Maybe we'd naturally go back outside where we've spent 99% of our evolutionary history if the tech wasn't keeping us indoors. So that's a thought there too. And one more little, as you were talking, I was like writing some notes down. I was thinking about this vacation that I just took with my family. We went to Shenandoah National Park. We did a lot of hiking, and I had my phone with me the whole time, and I justified it by saying, "Oh, we got to take pictures of these views, and we got to, if there's no pictures, it didn't happen." And so that's a fallacy in thinking, right? Like, I need to put the phone away, leave it at home. I can experience nature with my own two eyes, and I do not need any more pictures on my already overflowing camera roll that I'm spending how many dollars a month for iCloud storage for. So thank you so much for that reminder. What a conversation. This really lit me up, and I feel like I need to come out to your coast to meet you in person. But tell us, where can we find more of you online? Where can we find your books? Give us all of it.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. First, yes, please come out to the mossy green Pacific Northwest and go for a barefoot walk with me. So you can find me on Instagram at Lyanda Haupt. So it's LYANDAHAUPT. And you can find me at LyandaLynnHaupt.com. And if you go to my website, there's a place to sign up for my little newsletter that is free, that just has some thoughts and ideas and occasionally some writing prompts and that kind of thing. So meet me there.
I just want to thank you so much, Lyanda. I really, truly, genuinely enjoyed talking to you. I feel lit up and inspired. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. I loved every minute. Thank you.
Listeners, that's a wrap, my friends. Show notes are at MamaMinimalist.com/492. I've linked to all of Lyanda's goodness in this week's show notes. I have nothing else to say except that I will see you Thursday as always. Reach out if you need me, say hello, and I'll see you Thursday.